Awesome, everybody. Welcome to the Gilder Spotlight podcast. Today, I have a special guest. He's a Gilder member and he's also the host of the Businesses Blumin podcast. His name is Daniel Blumin, based out of Philly. But, Daniel, I'd love for you to give a quick background introduction to our Spotlight podcast guests.
Thanks for having me, and I want to wish you a happy 4th of July. So, for those that don't know, Taiga's actually in Japan right now, and he's recording early in the morning on the 4th. So, we're celebrating our independence. So, shout out for that. Just want to wish everyone a happy holidays. But yeah, I appreciate the introduction. So, to give a brief background, I was born in Israel, moved to America in 2002, grew up outside Philly for most of my life. I went to Penn State, studied business, had an interesting corporate career, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But ultimately, kind of some things didn't end up working out. The economy wasn't so well. COVID happened, interest rates, all that fun stuff. I'm not going to bore everyone with the economic activity out there and the economic downturn of the last few years. But essentially, about a year ago, I thought about the kind of work that I really wanted to do and have always been really curious and loved asking questions. So that's where I came up with the idea for my podcast and named it after my last name. So my last name is Blumin, named it Businesses Blumin, and about 2 months ago pivoted to focus more on entrepreneurship because when I started it, I wanted to focus broadly on business, but over time found out that I resonated more with entrepreneurs. So I decided I wanted to focus on that, and now I'm on a mission to build the world's number one entrepreneurship podcast.
Daniel, yeah, I love that. I love the mission too. I think your podcast is something that'll help a lot of different entrepreneurs all over the world. But I want to take a little step back and talk
Sure.
about. So you're originally born in Israel, and you were around two or three, or how old were you when you came to the States?
Sure. So I was three. The shorter
Okay.
version of it was my dad ended up getting a job around here that we were supposed to basically move to America for a year. The project that he was on ended up getting extended for another year. And what happened was after 2 years, the division that he worked in closed down. So he ended up getting laid off, and we were kind of stranded in America. I think this is like 2004, 2005. So what ended up happening is my family had to make a conscious decision of, all right, we're going to move back to Israel or we're going to stay. We ended up staying, ended up moving from kind of the suburbs of one suburb of Philadelphia to another suburb of Philadelphia. And that's kind of the short version of how we ended up here. But I was three when I moved. Hebrew was actually my first language. Unfortunately, didn't end up retaining it so well. But what's interesting, and it's funny to add, I always get, whenever I go on a first date, I always get a question like, where are you from? And it's like a tough answer because I have a lot of ambiguous backgrounds are really ethnically ambiguous. So, like I said, family's originally from, I was born in Israel, but my family's originally from Ukraine. So I actually grew up speaking Russian. So Russian was my second language. And English was number three, and looks like my tiny brain couldn't hold that many languages. So ended up forgetting Hebrew, and gladly today still speak English and still speak Russian. So that's the short version of that.
Wow. That, yeah, I had no, that's such a unique background, very eclectic, and yeah, yeah, I mean, I'm sure like a lot of a lot of different dates, they're probably like, yeah, like, so are you Ukrainian? Are you Israelian? Are you American? I guess you consider yourself American though at heart since you've been here pretty much for like the root of your upbringing and your adolescence and
I would say
university,
so.
right?
If someone was asking me kind of culturally what I was, I mean, culturally, I would say more Israeli, Ukrainian, because,
Hmm.
it's funny, I actually have a lot of Israeli friends and a lot of Eastern European friends as well, and kind of vibe with both cultures, like a bunch of different food. I eat a ton. I'm a big foodie. That's a total
Hmm.
side thing. But I would say probably a combination of them. I wouldn't say I identify as like solely American or solely Israeli or solely Ukrainian. I just think, I have appreciation of a lot of cultures, and a lot of them have different benefits. So that's kind of my vibe and how I go about it. On a
And
more, I guess, federal or specific note, I have dual citizenship. So I have a U.S. citizenship and Israeli citizenship. That was
okay,
interesting.
wow, but not a Ukrainian. I've never met a tri citizen.
No, I don't have, I guess I don't know why I don't have Ukrainian citizenship. I mean, it's a little complicated. I don't know the whole legal background of it, but when my parents left, basically there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Ukraine.
Hmm.
And back when they left, I forget the exact year, essentially, they were kind of escaping communism and the USSR at the time. So when they left, technically it was the old Soviet Union, but the territory that they
Mm.
left, right now that territory is Ukraine. So that's where it gets, I guess, like a little technical or a little geographical. But I'm not sure why I don't have Ukrainian citizenship, but officially I'm just a dual citizen of Israel and America.
Wow. And when you first moved to America, what was I'm assuming since you were so young, you probably didn't really need to adapt since you started, being in America at 3. But for me, I had a little bit of I grew up in Montana, being half Japanese. I had a couple of, let's just say, like, I don't know, like confusions with like my race and ethnicity, just kind of being around all these kids from Montana, being like the only Japanese, half Japanese person. What was it like kind of growing up in Philly? I'm assuming there's probably a lot of folks that, I mean, did you kind of have maybe difficulties adapting, or did you have any challenges that you had kind of overcome in your upbringing from being from such a different culture than the US?
So it's an interesting question. So from what I vaguely remember, I mean, I don't know the age where kids start to specifically actually remember things. I think maybe around, I remember most things from 10 on. Before that, I guess it's kind of a blur. But from everything
Hmm.
that I can remember when I moved to America, so obviously I was 3, so I don't think I know much from like 0 to 3. Maybe I have faint,
Yeah.
small memories. But according to my mom, when we were going on the plane from Israel to America, I was like crying like a baby. I mean, I was a baby, so I guess that, in all fairness, that's what was happening. But I vaguely remember when we landed in America, there was, I remember this one daycare I went to. I think it was a Jewish daycare I was at, and we were living in like this apartment building. And I think I had a few friends at the time who were Jewish, but they were American. And I guess
Hmm.
it was a little difficult trying to acclimate because I think in the area that I was in, it was more kind of American Jews, so still had a similar religious culture, but a different kind of ethnic cultural vibe. And I know this is getting a little technical, so I think, my parents did their best to kind of get me to mesh with like other kids or kind of other people my age, but I felt like it was always tough meshing with people. Obviously everyone has their own backgrounds and, I love different cultures, but especially when you're younger, it's, and your parents kind of, I don't want to say condition you in like a bad sense, but you just grow up with the kind of vibe that you're used to and the traditions that you're used to. So when I was young, I think I was a playful kid, but it was tough, kind of trying to make friends with people who were kind of originally from that area, originally had friends there.
Hmm.
Thinking towards the next thing, I think that what I did was after that kind of Jewish daycare was that I think I went to like a Russian daycare, which is interesting because I'm
Oh,
not sure
wow.
if it was, I don't think it was like a specifically Jewish daycare or kind of Jewish day school, but it was a very Eastern European place. So I think for whatever reason, I think I maybe fit in better there just because culturally we were like a little more
Yeah.
European. So I remember that vividly. I think it was this place ABC Daycare. I don't know if it's still around. But after that, I remember I went to a kindergarten somewhere in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania. And I think back then I was a little more, by the time that was like when I was 5 or 6, I think then I was a little more acclimated to just American society, American life.
Hmm.
So I think I was able to make friends a little more easily there. But interestingly enough, I think that's when, going back to the original story, that's when everything happened with my dad's company and he ended up getting laid off. So around that area, or around that time, he ended up finding a job in America, and we ended up moving from one suburb of Philly to another suburb of Philly. So I basically started in the school district that I graduated from in first grade, or kind of midway first grade, which was really interesting because I think, obviously I was acclimated to American culture at the time, but I think it was tough for me to make friends when I was younger, just because a lot of people at that point are like 6 or 7, and I know I'm talking about
Yeah.
6 or 7 year olds as if they're adults, but a lot of people there, a lot of their parents were like friends with each other, and we were just
Right.
kind of newer to the community. So I always had trouble kind of making friends there, but I would say most of my friends growing up, a few kids that I know from school, but I knew them from school because I knew them from like outside of school activities from like this one friend group that I had. And this one friend group is mostly kind of Israelis and like also people from Eastern Europe. So some people from my school, some people from other schools. So in short, ended up staying closer culturally with a lot of the different friends that I have and friends that I had growing up. Some of them happen to be in school, but a lot of them are just kind of around the area. Same different kind of schools, but same kind of friend group, if that makes sense. So in
Yeah.
short, it was kind of tough, but over time, thankfully, I ended up finding my group of people.
Yeah, because I mean, since English isn't your first language, and Russian and Hebrew are, I guess, technically your first and second languages, I'm assuming there's probably, a couple years of adaptation, and did you have like an accent when you first started speaking English, or uh, was there anything like that?
So thinking back, I don't think I had an accent when I spoke English,
Yeah,
but interestingly enough, I hear that when I speak Russian. Apparently, I have an Israeli accent. So I don't know, if
interesting.
that means anything.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing is a lot of my friends tell me that my grammar isn't as well when I speak in Russian. But when I think about it, like Israel also has like a bit of a different grammar. I'm not sure how, the exact technicals or the exact like verb subject
Hmm.
things go. But apparently, I speak Russian with like Israeli grammar. So I think the languages got a little messed up in my
Interesting.
head. So yeah, I think what's interesting is so I can speak Russian, but I can't read or write it. Hebrew, I
Hmm.
can't speak it, but I can read a little bit. And I guess
Hmm.
thankfully English, I guess you'll be the judge of that, depending on how I'm speaking. I can speak just fine, but
Right.
that's the vibe around that. But I do remember, you actually bring up a funny memory. When I was in, I think second and third grade, I was in ESL classes. So I think when you're a young kid, obviously you don't know what's going on. You're just either the teacher puts a piece of paper in front of you and you just start
Right.
writing. But I think thinking back, teachers probably went to my parents and were like, "Look, like this kid does not know English. Like you have to put him in another class." So when I was younger, I think there's definitely some kind of adaptation to that for sure.
And I know Israel has one of the top R&D, like research and development, kind of countries in the world, and there's a pretty big entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I know that you just became an entrepreneur with your Blumin podcast, but how long have you kind of been wanting to become an entrepreneur? Has that always kind of been um, kind of a goal in your career path to become an entrepreneur, or what originally got you into entrepreneurship?
So, fun fact, this is the latest statistic I heard. I'm not sure how recent this is, but I think 40% of Israel's GDP is tech. So it goes to show how
Yeah,
much they keep reinvesting in R&D and a
right.
lot of great startups coming out of Israel. But to answer your question, I think growing up, and I'll get into a bit of my career, but I think I was always a little bit different, had trouble fitting in. Sometimes a lot of people tell me I tend to speak really fast. That's something I've been working on, and thankfully I'm not speaking too fast right now. But always, I guess, just saw things a little differently, or always was a little quirky. And even when the first few jobs that I had, maybe when I started, I was 14 or 15. I just wasn't great at them. It just wasn't something that I could do well. And it didn't seem like a lack of effort. It just seemed like the unwritten vibe was just it wasn't a great fit. So I always had that kind of bit of weirdness, just to kind of take it a bit of a step further. So going to my senior year in high school, I really wanted to go to Penn State. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to major in, and that's when I heard that Penn State had this new major called corporate innovation and entrepreneurship. So at that time, I was like,
Wow.
okay, this is kind of cool, and I ended up learning a little bit about it. And it was a newer major that seemed to touch on all the subjects in more of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, education environment. So I thought to myself, if I ever got interested in like finance, marketing, or accounting, with all due respect to all
Yeah.
academic departments out there, I thought to myself like that, all that's in textbooks. I could always learn that. I could always, learn income statements or the three financial statements or what ROAS or all these different marketing topics are. I don't want to spend a bunch of tuition money on, old coursework or just stuff that I could teach myself. And the CN, well, corporate innovation entrepreneurship, but they called it CN for short. A lot of that classwork was a lot more modern and more updated. So that's why I decided to go with that major. So I think I went into college, interestingly enough, thinking I wanted to do my own thing. And I used to
Hmm.
jot down a bunch of these like different product ideas. I think I still probably have them written somewhere. But over time, I don't know why, I just didn't resonate as much with like starting my own thing. I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll work a job for a few years and then I'll see the kind of vibe. So I ended up after college working in a consulting role. Well, actually, I should backtrack a bit. After college, during the later part of my college years, I got more interested in finance with everything that was happening during the pandemic, especially with what was going on with interest rates and just the volatility and valuations at the time. So after college, really wanted to work in investment banking. But for those that remember, even back then when interest rates were down, M&A activity in like mid 2020 or like late 2020 wasn't quite there yet. So unfortunately, wasn't able to get a gig in banking. Ended up getting a gig in consulting, thinking it would be more M&A advisory, transaction stuff. Ended up not being the case. So during my time there, I ended up trying to get a new role. Long story short, with my first job, didn't end up working out as I was looking for a new job. Kind of that job didn't work out. Ended up leaving that place. So at the same time, left that place and had a bit of time to look for a new job or look for that banking job, essentially. But and what's interesting enough about this story, it's like late 2020, I was looking for a banking job. 2021 had a job, thinking it was going to be M&A advisory. It didn't work out. 2022, ended up deciding to search for a new job. In pursuit of that new job, obviously, stuff didn't work out with the other job, as I mentioned.
Hmm.
But it sounds like the one window where there was prime M&A activity, maybe I should have started looking a little earlier. But essentially, when I really started dedicating myself to the search, this was like mid 2022. So when interest rates were going up, deal activity went down. Unfortunately, wasn't able to get a job in banking. Was really close a few times. If there's a few MDs out there listening to this, they probably remember some of the conversations I had with them. But in short, didn't end up working out. So I ended up moving back home and really thought about the kind of work that I wanted to do. So I've always been really curious. I've always really liked asking questions. I've always been interested in like random facts. Like one of the things that I do is randomly memorizing celebrities' birthdays. I think I share the same birthday with Wayne Gretzky. As a matter of fact, it just came to mind. But
Yeah.
always really liked asking questions, and even when I was in college, I always really liked asking deep and thoughtful questions. Sometimes I'd ask like the TA's questions, and they would be like, "Okay, I don't know the answer. Just ask the professor," or something like that. So I'd make it past that first level. But in short, always really enjoyed asking questions and thought about the kind of work I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, if I enjoy asking questions, is there any way I could pursue this as a career? And that's kind of where the podcast came to be. And I guess to get back to what we were saying earlier, did that for a bit, and then I decided I wanted to, well, not did that for a bit, did the podcast. I'm doing the podcast, and over time decided that I resonate the most with entrepreneurs just because they also have the most quirky stories. So when I
Right.
started it, was fortunate enough to talk to entrepreneurs, investors, and other business people, other executives, other managers. But over time, wanted to hone on entrepreneurs, and that's kind of how the podcast came to be.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's also just interesting with the timing of getting into consult. I also think starting your career in consulting is one of the most difficult endeavors. I feel like a lot of folks start their career working kind of as a corporate grunt, understanding kind of business, and then kind of get into consulting. And then also M&A is just incredibly difficult too. That's probably one of the most difficult things to get into. Just because I think it takes what, like 6 months in order to do due diligence for one deal. So it's a long time game, and it's a lot of due diligence. So you definitely have a really good experience and two of the most difficult things to get involved with in business and kind of understanding that. Um, I think it helps with your podcast, absolutely. And I 100% agree that some of those interesting people are definitely entrepreneurs. Just because I don't remember actually what podcast I was listening to, maybe it was Lex Friedman, but he was
We love
talking to
Lex.
another entrepreneur. Oh yeah, I love Lex. We love Lex. But he was saying that you need a level of quirkiness or kind of like a level of, I don't want to say like insanity in order to think that you can create something that can change the world. And so I think a lot of entrepreneurs have that quirkiness to them in order to think differently because it's again one of the hardest endeavors to get into rather than just being a corporate grunt working your way up the ladder, and just doing one mundane task job for 250 days out of the year.
For
But
sure. Does take a bit of quirkiness. And if someone says you have to be insane, like I wouldn't blame them for using that term. The one thing I wanted to add really quickly though, I think the one thing that they don't teach you as much in a corporate environment, and I think you end up learning very quickly in an entrepreneurship environment, is that it's not all science. It's not all just like formulas. And I think one thing that they don't teach you in school, and if they did, I think a lot of people would be better set up. They don't really teach you the art of relationship management, the art of business, the art of feeling a situation out, which I think is somewhat applicable in corporate America, but it's very, very applicable in entrepreneurship. So I think that's just something I wish people taught a little more of in college.
100%. Well, and I want to kind of dive back into your podcast, and understand because I remember we were talking earlier, a couple days ago, that there is a really unique skill set in order to know how to ask people the right questions, but then also finding kind of a good balance or justifiable medium of having like a casual conversation as well. So it's kind of an entertaining, kind of fun conversation as far as a podcast. But what would you consider the Businesses Blumin podcast? What kind of style of interviewer are you? And then we can kind of, yeah, what would you say like, yeah, your style of interview is?
Sure. Well, Tiger, you're doing great, by the way,
I
as someone on
appreciate
the
it.
other end. I've been a guest on a handful of podcasts, and I really like the way you ask questions. So, hands down,
Hey,
you're definitely
I appreciate
doing
it.
great here. So, I wanted to make sure the audience knew that for anyone that's interested in starting a podcast or getting into this kind of industry, the way he asks questions, and I'll get into, my Scientology or my process in a bit, but the way you do it is really, really great. So, I just wanted to emphasize that. But in terms of how I do questions, just to get a little more on a higher level here, I think that the biggest challenge is that, a lot of people can read someone's biography, maybe come up with some basic questions, but when you're in the nature of a conversation, such as the one that we're having now, it's very tough in your head to balance, the current conversation you're having with the direction you want to go in. And I think that to get better at that, it's really two things. One, and this is going to sound really cliche, it's just something you get better at with practice over time. You start to feel out. Two, you have to practice maybe a little bit of open-mindedness because obviously going into a conversation, maybe you have a direction for where you want to go, but you also have to be conscious and listening in the moment and be able to make like a split second decision because no one's perfect and sometimes people lose track of thoughts and that stuff happens. I mean, it's happened to me on like a handful of podcasts, and I wouldn't suggest to if someone's creating a podcast or working on that to edit all that stuff out because I think people like that authenticity, like that quirkiness as we were talking about earlier. But with regards to how I go on it, and I guess before I get into the specific methodology that I go to, I probably have to shout out Danny Miranda here because I don't want to say stole this methodology from him, but listening to his podcast, I started to notice like small tactics that he used to ask questions and the certain research that he did. And I was like, oh, like that's a good idea. I should probably do something similar. But in short, the way I do podcasts, the way I do research, in comparison to other podcasts, and I feel like I've been teasing this for a second. This is the last teaser I'll get into, but I feel like a lot of business podcasts that I listen to out there do really high level research. I mean, they interview I don't want to say celebrities, but celebrity entrepreneurs or really high profile entrepreneurs where their successes are very publicized. So people are just tuning in from their really existing audience. So they're not really doing a deep dive research into it. They're just kind of reading high level bio. Kind of what I do is in differentiation from a lot of podcasts, and I'm more than happy to share this because if other people do this, that just means they're having more in-depth conversations and everyone's just elevating the entrepreneurial community even more. But I'll do a deep dive when I'm doing a research for a podcast episode into someone's bio, and then I'll also kind of stalk through their social medias to see if there's anything interesting out there. I'll also go back and listen to other interviews that they've been on, be it podcast interviews or if they've had different TV appearances. I'll also try to search up any literature they've written, so any articles that they have, any books that they've written, stuff like that, any snippets I can get. And then I'll just do a broad Google search just to see if there's anything quirky I can find out there. So that's the research methodology that I go through. And as I'm going through each of those sections, I'll kind of come up with bullet points or questions I want to ask. And then at the end of that, I'm whittled down to 15 or 20 questions that for the episode. And then I usually kind of concise that. I don't know if concise that is a word, but we're going to pretend like it is. But I usually make that into 15 or so questions. And then that gives me a good direction for the episode to last about an hour. Whereas I can ask those questions, but then also while I'm, doing the episode, I can just take notes on the side for whenever I want to ask something. So that's kind of the broad answer for how I do research and how I go about my
Wow.
business for the shows.
And I know you kind of answered it while answering this last question,
Sure.
but what differentiates you from like the Tim Ferriss show, the Lex Friedman podcast? Maybe kind of these are more kind of business focused podcasts. I know Lex kind of dives into other, avenues, but as far as how you conduct your podcast, what is the major differentiator?
Sure. So before I get into that, just want to shout out Lex Friedman. Love your podcast, man. Listen to a bunch of episodes. He's a fantastic host, and if he's ever in Philly, hit me up. I know he got his PhD at Drexel, so always happy to grab coffee, and I would love to pick your brain. So by the off chance he's listening, I just shamelessly say that. So I'll answer it in two ways. I'll get into the comparison with Lex Friedman, or I guess the Lex Friedman, the Joe Rogans of the world, and then I'll talk more like the Tim Ferrisses, Alex Hormozzi's, the Guy Raz's of the world. So in regards to, say, for example, Lex Friedman, I would say I'm different from him in the sense that I'm trying to own the entrepreneurship niche or try to be known as, the world's number one entrepreneurship podcast. So I think I have a portion of this. We were talking about this maybe a little bit earlier, but a portion of my pitch deck where I make an analogy of how I want to be seen. So when people think of running shoes, probably instantaneously they think of Nike. So when people think of podcast, I want to be the first thought that comes to mind, like business is blooming or entrepreneurship podcast, business is blooming. So I want it to almost like resonate automatically with people. So that's my goal with that. So I'd say in comparison to kind of Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan, while we're all using podcast mediums, I think they have a bit broader of a focus. Like Joe Rogan is probably all over. He's, interviewed a gazillion people from MMA fighters to comedians to business people to scientists. And I would say similar on the Lex Friedman as well. So they happen to be very good generalists. So I wouldn't since I'm talking in their podcast or their terms a little more generally, I don't want to say I'm better or worse than them, but I'm just a bit of a different niche, a little more focused than what they're doing. Obviously, I have a lot of love for them, but they're just a little more general. Speaking to the business sense, so talking about the Alex Hormozis of the world, or kind of the Tim Ferrisses of the world, or any of these other really publicly known, I want to say, I hate to use the word business influencer, but like well-known entrepreneur, I'll just put it that way. I think that's a little more politically correct. Similar to what I was talking about earlier, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think a lot of them broadly just focus on the successes of entrepreneurs. I mean, they might talk a little bit about their stories earlier on, but what I'll notice is, say for example, if an episode's an hour long, like the first 10 or 15 minutes will be like what stuff sucked, and then 45 minutes will be like, oh, like you made an exit. What are you doing after the exit? What I'm trying to do is make the whole hour long podcast where maybe we're talking about that exit towards the later point of like the 45-minute or 50-ish minute mark or toward the end of the episode. And the duration of the episode is really that journey from the start to the finish. And what's beautiful about that is I could talk to entrepreneurs, say for example, if they started a successful venture, could talk through the life of that venture. But what's even more beautiful is, and obviously I don't wish failure upon anyone, but as we know, and most startups fail, and most entrepreneurs have a few failures behind them before they strike gold or they're successful. And we can go through those conversations about what happened to those companies and what they learned and how are they able to move forward. So I just think mine is a little more authentic in comparison to a lot of the other business podcasts that are out there. And it also never hurts to have a new name out there. I'll put it that way.
Right. 100% no, and I love how, because I do agree. I think a lot of podcasts, you start listening to them in like the first, 15, 20 minutes, it's super cut and dry, and it's not that fun to listen to, but really kind of the meat of the podcast is like the, kind of the peak as far as what you want to hear. So I love how you make the whole entire episode entertaining and fun. And so kind of to go off that, how many episodes have you done? And how often do you record?
Sure. So right now, officially published 96 episodes. We were
Okay.
talking, funny enough, we were talking about this a little off
Amazing.
air earlier, but working on episode 97 right now with a really special guest. Not going to reveal too much, but I guess by the time this is published, people will know. So,
Yeah.
by the off chance that this is published before then, someone that knows a lot about fundraising, and if anyone's out there looking to raise for the first time or raise for another time, definitely something to listen into. But that was a shameless plug for the episode I'm working on. But working on episode 97 right now. Excited to get
Wow.
to that 100 mark and move forward from there. Obviously, with a media platform, the business model is a little more complicated than kind of your typical business where you just sell a product and then you just go down the financial statement to get your bottom line. My business model obviously revolves more around building an audience, working with sponsors or advertisers, and then other lines like affiliate revenue or having a merchandise. There's a merch shop, by the way, if anybody's curious to check that out. Sorry, shameless plug. But that's kind of a little bit about the business model to go off on a bit of a tangent there. But working on episode 97 and excited to get to that 100 mark soon. It's been a hard journey, much harder than I thought it would be, but excited to keep going and see where we go.
Amazing. And what are the kind of things that you're doing in order to market your podcast?
Sure. So I think the main thing that I'm doing now, probably very general that a lot of people are doing across social media. So I
Hmm.
have business pages. Well, I have personal pages across most platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X/Twitter, whatever you prefer out there. I think most people probably call it Twitter, so it'll be interesting to see,
Yeah.
how long it takes people to keep calling it X. But what I also have is a business account. And when I say business account, I mean a podcast account on all those platforms out there. So there's a Business is Blooming page on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, Threads, basically any social or any main social platform out there. And my main marketing right now is pretty much just what I do is I split it up into two promotional periods. And this is, I guess, some of the secret sauce that some people might be interested in. But essentially, when I release the episode, I'll publish a clip with like a blurb for the business side and then a blurb for the personal side. And then I'll pretty much copy and paste that across both the business accounts and the personal accounts. I'll change a little bit based on the platform just because the different platforms like different kind of formats. So that's pretty much what I'm currently doing. In regards to that secondary promotion, I think I'm actually working on a bit of the strategy right now. So this isn't as concrete of an answer, but we'll essentially schedule that out over a few days. So say, for example, if there's 9 clips from an episode, one of those clips I'll share as like, the primary promotion. We'll have like a big blurb and we'll have stuff around that. And the 8 other clips I'll pretty much schedule out to kind of go out for like the next 3 or 4 days. So that's a little bit about how I'm marketing the podcast. I'll say the other big help or the other big marketer, obviously my priority is having a good story, but say for example, if I'm interviewing someone and they happen to have a big audience, if you tag them in your posts or they reshare it or kind of they publish it as their own thing, that obviously always helps, but that's more of an indirect approach or more of a serendipitous kind of thing in regards to growing the show.
Definitely. No, and that's yeah, I like that strategy of posting casual clips and then business focused clips. And another question, do you think that, and this is what I've experienced, I feel like the bigger the guests that I have on, they're less likely to repost on their own social media pages. And I feel like more of the, I don't know, like the mom and pop shop type of guests, like the more organic guests that you have on, it seems to yield maybe more eyes onto that certain episode, and then you can kind of gain followers and gain traction from that. What have you noticed as far as, do you think that the bigger the guests that you have on, do you gain more kind of followers to your show, or kind of if you have kind of the smaller guests that actually are more willing to like repost? Where have you found kind of like the sweet spot as far as who to have on as a guest? How can you maximize, um, promote their promotion?
So, as any great answer, it's a dynamic answer. So, it's not a yes or no answer. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that, the way the human psychology works, and I'm no psychologist, but I think people love great stories and they love hearing great stories. So, regardless of your guest, if you hear someone saying something interesting, I think it'll have solid engagement on social media. That being said, all things equal, it definitely helps to have a bigger guest.
Hmm.
But I'll say this. I'll say for example, like I'm in the entrepreneurship niche, and I wouldn't do this, but hypothetically speaking, in regards to this situation, say if I had some, we'll call it like professional soccer player on the show, right? So say if that soccer player has like 2 or 3 million followers, right? What will happen is I'll have that soccer player on, and then or that professional athlete on, assuming they don't have any business endeavors, and I just ask them about their life, so something not related to the show. Sure, I might have a lot of organic content. I might gain a lot of listeners or followers because of that, and numbers wise, that might look good, but that's really short term thinking because that's just not the niche of my show. And the way I see it is that's just kind of chasing cloud and chasing numbers as opposed to really providing value to your audience and what you want to do. So, all things evened out and like all things included, I'd rather have, an entrepreneur with a smaller audience than just like a big celebrity with a bigger audience if that big celebrity isn't really in the entrepreneurial sphere. That being said, similar to what I was saying earlier, all things being equal, if it's two different entrepreneurs, but one ends up having like a bigger audience, or if I'm interviewing someone with like a big audience, but they fit my niche, then I think that's like the ultimate, dynamic that hits every single vertical for an episode that would get a lot of engagement, if that makes sense. So I think the short answer is I prioritize having a great story. That being said, if there's someone that fits the mold of who I'm looking for to have on the show and they have a big audience, that just adds fuel to the fire of it. So it's not a yes or no answer, but a
Yeah.
dynamic around that. Rarely do you get someone, I guess. I mean, maybe we'll see as I grow and as I, hopefully become the number one podcast. Maybe I can get a lot of those people who are entrepreneurs and end up, they're more in the later part of their careers. But right now, I think my priority is having someone with a story, and if they happen to have a big audience, that's great as well.
I love that. And it's no small feat to get to 97 episodes. And
Appreciate
it's
it.
only you've been doing this for about a year, or when was kind of episode one?
I think episode one, well, about a year. I think a little bit less than a year, but I think episode one was
Wow.
July
Okay.
10th. So I guess I don't know if 100 episodes in a year is impressive or not, or this or
No, that
that,
is
but I feel
that's
I
no
feel
small feat.
relatively accomplished. I'll put it that way. But
Yeah.
yeah, in about a year to do 100 episodes is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's I mean that's about 2 episodes a week, which is I mean I have a hard time doing 1 or 2 episodes a month. So that's amazing. And
I will say I'll add really quickly that I think the one mistake I made in the beginning, and this was
Mhm.
especially prevalent to before I rebranded more entrepreneurship, I think I was a little naive in the beginning, and obviously we all make mistakes trying to build something. That's just how life is. But I think early on, in November, I booked until like the end of April. So I basically booked
Oh
like
wow.
4 episodes a week. I was like, okay, I'll just have like Friday off. So I was
Hmm.
thinking, I was like, okay, this will be great. I'll just publish every day, blah, blah, blah. I ended up realizing that doing the same thing every single day, I mean, obviously you get better at it over time. That's a silver lining, but I underestimated just how grueling it was just to like get all of it to like look beautiful, to like edit those shorts, to make that look nice. And I was basically by mid I wouldn't say by mid February I stopped booking until like I was like, okay, I'm gonna take a break until like I get to April just so I can have like a week hiatus just to figure this out.
Yeah.
But I think by mid January or kind of like February I realized that that was probably a mistake to do something every
Mhm.
single day, and also it can overwhelm your audience if you're just like consistently publishing something with like a different guest every single day.
Right.
So maybe that I guess contributed to the the big number, but looking back, it was probably a mistake to do that many episodes. I think right now I'm more focused on just putting one great quality episode a week. I know we were
Hmm.
talking about this off air a little bit, but pursuing venture funding right now, if I'm able to get that, if I'm able to build a little bit of a staff and make a little bit more money from it, then maybe I could pursue have two episodes a week. But for now, I'm just focused on putting together one really great quality episode a week in the entrepreneurship niche. So that's a little bit about
Yeah.
some of the mistakes that I made and how I want to move forward and then publish onward.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, so up until February, you're doing about four every single week. How were you able to keep up with as far as doing the research on the guests? Because it seems like that's a lot to juggle, having four different people on the podcast. And I know that you've slowed down since then, but kind of during that peak time of it sounds like from last fall to February, how were you able to juggle so many different guests? That's about I know Joe Rogan has about four new episodes every single week, but I feel like he doesn't do the type of research that you do into his guests. It seems like you do, the little bit of background research. You Google them, you understand their social media. What was kind of that secret sauce as far as having a good, genuine conversation every single day with a new guest?
The cost of my sanity, to say it plainly, it was
Yeah,
very very difficult. By January, I realized I was like, why did I do this? Like this was so
yeah,
like it was tough at the time because I think an issue a lot of entrepreneurs run into is that a lot of times they'll get stressed out, and I think they'll ask themselves, okay, am I just stressed out because I'm worried about because this isn't something I want to be doing, or am I stressing out about the result? And that's a conscious conversation I had to have with myself. And I think with me it was more stressing about the result, which in a way this sounds weird was a relief because I still loved like the actual interviews, and obviously I was still doing a ton, but even though I wasn't getting as much engagement early on, but to get back into your specific question, it was just really exhausting, candidly. Like I'm not gonna put up a front and say it was easy or I just it was nothing. It was a lot, and I think the big lesson I learned is that and this goes back to the engagement thing that I was just talking about. If you're just pumping stuff out, and I think like there are some quality episodes there, but if you're just doing something constantly, if something is like super process oriented, super sciencey, like there's no room for like that artistic aspect. There's no room to improve quality. And I think when the Passover holiday came around, I think I took like a week off just to mentally reset and to figure out a direction forward. And I think around then I was also planning around the rebrand, so that obviously helped with the vision going forward. But I think, early on, as I said earlier, it was at the cost of my sanity. And also, I realized that it was very tough to put something quality out when you're just focused on quantity, quantity, quantity. So I think one of the conscious decisions that I made was to scale back to initially I wanted to do twice a week. I realized even two really good quality episodes a week is a little challenging. I should probably start at one, more the crawl approach. So that's kind of how I went from what I was doing to what I'm doing now. But the short answer to your question was like I was exhausted. It was very, very hard, very difficult. I think the toughest part was I tried to have, as much of an EOS or kind of, I guess POS, podcast operating system as much as I
yeah,
can. But the issue is, you'll have tech issues, or if you have like something like, say for example, if an episode takes longer to load, or if you end up having to have a meeting for something random or talking to a potential
hmm,
advertiser, like that blows up your whole week. And then as opposed to being able to wake up at 6 a.m., like you wake up at 9 a.m. and then you have to go to the gym
right,
at like 9 p.m. that day, and then your whole week blows up. So in short, it was really hard. I wanted to have a schedule as much as I could, but essentially I realized that the more signed up I was, or enough signed up is a word, but the more booked up I was, and just the more I was pumping stuff out every day, the less room I had for creativity. And also,
hmm,
when something came up, as I mentioned, my week would just blow up. So I
right,
realized early on, might as well scale it back a bit and just really focus on the quality first. And that's how I want to move forward. But, in short, look, lesson learned. And,
yeah,
I'm happy to be moving forward. And I think the silver lining is I did learn really well what goes into the process of creating a great episode and the whole production process. But thankfully now I think I have a better approach moving forward. So I apologize for the long-winded answer, but that's kind of where
well,
I'm at.
and And to kind of piggyback off that, you're mentioning that, you wake up 6:30, go to the gym, and sometimes it get pushed back because you kind of just get overwhelmed with all the different guests. And I think podcasting is something that you want to have your mind as sharp as possible. Like it's not like a mundane task that you can show up, half asleep and just get it done. What would you say your morning routine is, and how do you stay optimal when you have so many podcasts coming up?
Sure. So when an entrepreneur does have a normal routine, that's a gift from God. I'll put it that way. When something's not
Right.
hitting the fan, as I'm sure you could probably relate to. But say an ideal day. I'll wake up at 6 a.m. By the time I do my whole morning routine, maybe have a bit of a snack. Usually I'm at the gym at 7, working out typically from 7 to 8:30, and then from 8:30 to 10, have breakfast, shower, do all that stuff. And then as of now, just to get people a little bit behind the scenes, since I'm still kind of running mostly the show by myself, pretty much from 10 to about 9 or 10 to 10, I'll get back into the latter end of a second, but in short, want to try to like leave that hour to like for like reading or winding down as much as I can. But essentially, say for example, from 10 to 9, I'm busy. So 10 to 9, I believe, is 11 hours minus 2 hours, we'll say for meals. By the way, as a side note, I think corporate America has like this thing of inflating their hours and they count their lunch or kind of these other meals as like hours worked. So I don't do
Yeah.
that. I just try to think of like hours worked specifically. I think people are like, oh, I worked 8 hours today, when realistically, like, I think a corporate 8 hours and an entrepreneur 8 hours are two totally different
Yeah.
things, but that's conversation for another day. I won't get too into that
Right.
tangent. But essentially, say for example, we'll call it a Monday, right? So if I have a recording on a Tuesday, probably early on a Monday morning from 10 to, we'll call it 1 o'clock, I'll be doing research for the guest. Probably around 1 to 2, we'll take a break for lunch. Then 2 to 5, here's where it gets a little bit dynamic. Say, for example, if I still have clips to work on from like the previous week or the previous week's episode isn't published yet, we'll go work on that to give people a bit of an image of what goes on in the back end. There's certain SEO work that you have to do, certain tags that you have to research, basically things to optimize, engagement on social media. Or say, for example, if I have that done, then I'll kind of tackle my to-do list. So that'll be reaching out to investors or working out like some small video kinks or some small video features that I want to add. So say, for example, that might be 2 to 5, 5 to 6, maybe take another break for a meal, and then 6 to 9 or 6 to 10, depending on if anything blew up or if anything requires my attention or should hit the fan. We'll assume things are going well. So we'll say 6 to 9, just tackling that to-do list. So if you're curious what right now what it looks like, it's trying to talk to investors, trying to see the right kind of people that would be great to bring on as partners for the podcast, trying to talk to advertisers, trying to talk to sponsors. So that I would say is like the overall routine. And usually from 9 to 10 or 9 to 10:30 is when I'll kind of do my night routine, try to read for a little bit. Right now, reading 11 Rings by Phil Jackson. I've gotten into memoirs, and this one's pretty good, about 100 pages in. So I really like reading that. But I'd say that's pretty much a summary of what a typical perfect day would be like. Now, that being said, as I said earlier, sometimes stuff comes up. But I try to keep it as close to that schedule as I can because I realize that if I'm not really, really intentional with my time, even if an hour, 2 hour goes by here or there where, I'm not perfect, if I'm not spending my time as I should be spending it, that makes the rest of the week that much harder. So, while I'm human, those mistakes happen. I try to be as intentional with that schedule as I can for now.
It sounds like an amazing schedule. I couldn't agree more that I think in the corporate world, there's a lot of idle time where I think people are just sitting at their computer, not really doing much. And I think being an entrepreneur, you have to be productive at pretty much every hour that you're working. You have to get stuff done. It's more milestone based rather than sitting there and getting a paycheck. And even here in
Definitely.
Japan, I mean, people can't leave the office until their senpai leaves or their boss leaves. And so oftentimes in Japan, there's just people that are sitting at their computer all day wasting time, and not.
To mention two things at once, just to show you that I'm not perfect. I realized for the last and well, this will be funny for the audience. I realized for the last 10 minutes that my battery was like really close to dying. So I'll take this second to like plug my computer in really really
Yeah,
quickly, just to show everyone out there that we're not perfect. Entrepreneurs
right,
also.
right.
Oh, we're charging. We're good. We're not gonna
Awesome,
die on the
awesome. Yeah, I
internet.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm glad
So,
that I'm glad
yeah.
that
No.
this
Just
just didn't die out in the middle of the episode.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that was. I'm happy you brought that up because then I could just
yeah,
mention the fact that we're all not perfect, and in the entrepreneur
right.
schedule, you're trying to do multiple things at once. So happy we were able to get that out of the way. But I like how you're talking about in different cultures. I think especially in America, I think people like to almost inflate, as I was saying earlier, and as you were saying, their hours sometimes when realistically, if someone's working 8 hours a day. they're or someone has an 8 hour day schedule, they might be working like 3 to 4. An hour or two might be meals or talking to coworkers, and 2 hours might be like waiting to hear client feedback. Whereas, I'm curious to hear more about like the Japanese community here. But whereas in entrepreneurship, if you're working, say for example, 9 hours a day, not counting meals, like those 9 hours of work time, like you're fully optimized every single one of those hours, which is something I
Right.
just really wanted to emphasize out there if someone's ever thinking about making the leap.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's 100% results based and results driven. And to kind of go off that, what do you recommend new podcasters jumping in the world of podcasting? What would you say that I know that you went through a lot of challenges early on and you had a lot of learning lessons. What would you recommend to those starting out and starting a podcast?
So I'll say this, and I love the question. It's a great question. I think that, practically speaking, especially in the age of social media, everybody wants to have a bigger audience or a bigger following. Because thinking about it numbers wise or marketing wise, if you offer a service, if you have an audience of 1 million, if you end up selling something, assuming, you advertise this to your audience of 1 million and you convert 5% of it, that's still, what, 50,000 people, something like that. I hope my math is correct on there. That's, a huge number, huge money, huge sales. So I think practically people see it as bigger audience, bigger sales, more money at the end of the day, which is understandable. Like this is like the system we live in. That's how the world works. We're in a global economy. Competition is great for the consumer. That being said, I think, and this is going to sound a little counterintuitive to what I was just mentioning, and I think this goes to especially entrepreneurs. I think if they're doing it solely to grow their audience or solely for that monetary purpose, then I don't think it's a great idea because I think that people have a very good innate BS meter and they'll be able to tell if you're just kind of talking about dry topics and not things that are interesting. And I actually want to give a shout out to someone. Funny enough, there's someone I added my podcast. This guy, Will Nitza. So he's the founder of IQ Bar, and I actually bought one of his bars today earlier. I'll have to try it. I was actually talking to Will a little bit earlier, but he has a podcast called the Eating Glass Podcast. So for those that don't know, he's the founder of this company called IQ Bar. Really, really great CPG company. Essentially, he created like this really good snack bar. I don't know if that's the right word of saying it. Well, if that's not exactly how you describe it, my apologies, but I'm doing my best here. But essentially, he has a podcast called the Eating Glass Podcast where he interviews other CPG entrepreneurs or kind of other entrepreneurs in general. So similar to what I'm doing, but more on like the consumer product side. And I've listened to a few of his episodes, and his are like very, very authentic, very interesting, and he dives deeper into their stories. So that's a great example of an entrepreneur doing it right. I'm not going to mention any specific entrepreneurs who I don't think are doing it right, but I've seen on social media a lot of times people will just have a podcast just to solely grow their audience, and I think that's a really bad idea because it's really inorganic. So I just wanted to put that out there for anyone thinking about starting a podcast or just entrepreneurs in general, their main purpose behind it. It's got to be something other than money. There's got to be some kind of artistic or interest behind it to really make it work in the long run. That being said, to get more into the advice that I would have, I think early on, try to keep it as simple as possible. Even me, I've been doing this about, I want to say, about a year, as you mentioned earlier. I think there's a process that I keep, and funny enough, I keep it on this one app called Mural. So Mural is like virtual sticky notes. So I just kind of move the arrow as I keep going. It's pretty much what my process looks like. But that process, I ended up iterating like 15 or 20 times. Every time you learn something a little bit new, how to make something a little bit better. So I would say in the beginning, for anyone starting out, if this is something that you really, really want to do, take it very, very easy in the beginning. Try to keep it simple. Because if you try to do 30 things at once, you're never going to get started. So I think the perfect first episode, for example, Riverside, what we're actually using right now, has a free account or a freemium model where you can use like a free basic plan, and they have all the basic things that you need to record an episode. So, say for example, if you're someone that wants to have a podcast, you can invite a guest on to record the episode. You recorded the episode. Riverside thankfully has a bunch of features that let you make clips. So essentially, what I would do is take a few of those. Don't put a crazy amount of effort into them. Maybe just throw some captions on them, stuff like that, and then have those clips. And then that clip just like publish on social media. Don't think too much to make like the perfect caption or the description. Just say, "Hey, I had this person on my show." Honestly, people will appreciate that more because I think people like when you just speak plain English these days. Which is something I'm trying to learn as well. But I would say, in short, take it really easy. Just kind of, record an episode, publish it, see what kind of feedback you get, and then every time try to think of like one small thing to improve. And if you've been doing it about a year, you'll end up seeing that, where you are from day one to where you are now is leaps and bounds. And I think the best way to quantify that, or the best way for someone to imagine that, is I try to think of my process that I do right now for an episode. And I'll say for, one episode that I do right now, say for example, it'll take me 2 to 3 days to put together, with the current process that I have. If I showed the current process I have right now to like day one Daniel, first of all, he'd be like, I don't know like what the hell this says. But like day one Daniel would probably take 2 or 3 weeks to put that together. So a lot of it is just muscle memory and just having knowledge. But I think the short answer would be is just start really basic, and every time look for like one small thing to improve, and over time all those improvements will add up. So that's my advice for anyone that wants to get into this kind of thing.
I think that's fantastic advice for almost anything kind of that you start out. I think little by little, day by day, keep it simple. You know the acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah,
That's what
I honestly,
starting out my career.
even
That's
when
what
I'm doing
everyone.
like my process, and yeah,
Yeah.
for sure, even when I'm doing my process, I try to keep it as simple as possible. Because if there's anything I've realized, I struggle with this too. Whenever I try to do a million things at once, it just things end up getting lost. So I just try to like
Mhm.
think what the basic goal is, and then step by step, like you know, take a few steps back, or like move step by step backward, just to like think, okay, like what are all these baby steps I can do to accomplish this goal. So keep it
Mhm.
simple, stupid is definitely a great acronym for sure.
Well, Daniel, I really appreciate this conversation. Do you have any other final thoughts or any other, words of advice or words of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience? And then also, how can they find you?
Sure. So, one, Tyga, I wanted to say thanks so much for taking the time. Really enjoy being on the other side of the mic as well. I'm used to being in your seat, so always nice to experience it from the other side, and really appreciate the great questions. But I think if there's one thing I'd leave people with, and this is a thought I've been having recently, and definitely something I've struggled with as well, but have gotten a little bit better at. Not to get into too personally, but obviously, in life, a lot of things come up, and everyone has some kind of challenges that they're dealing with out there. I think that growing up, and maybe this is something that gets easier as you get older, but if anyone's struggling with this, just a thought to have. I think that people spend a lot of times trying to like rationalize life, trying to rationalize if I do A, then like B will happen, or like X, Y, Z. For better or for worse, I've kind of realized that life is a little more art than science, and a lot of things are very, very unpredictable. And I'm not going to get into the whole, religious conversation or this or that, but I think that when you spend too much time trying to rationalize life or rationalize a lot of things happening around you, you can end up going crazy. And this is much easier said than done, but a lot of times you just have to kind of look at things, especially in business or in entrepreneurship, as like, things happen, obviously you can feel it out. Don't ruminate too much on it, try to understand the situation and move forward. I think that's where maybe the irrational aspect of entrepreneurship comes from. But in short, I would say don't sweat a lot of things too much. I think as much as dire as people think it is, unfortunately, we're all going to die one day. So don't try to rationalize everything. Try to understand things as they come, and let life happen for you, and then move forward from that. So that's my philosophical note for the day. If anyone wants to find me, name's Daniel Blumin on LinkedIn and all the other socials. Feel free to reach out. Always love having a conversation. Tyga, thanks again so much for having me on. Love the conversation and love the questions you asked.
Daniel, I love that word of advice. I think that was fantastic advice, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I'll put all your information in the show notes, and I really appreciate your time. Cheers, everybody.